welcome to the Jesus Movement Live. It's a pleasure to be here. It's great to have you join us tonight. We are continuing on with our series, A Journey to Faith. We are now on lesson 82. That makes us about a year and 2/3 in, so this is becoming a university-style course. It's a long course, and it's just a testament to how huge the Bible is and everything that it covers and what's associated with it historically. Tonight's lesson is called Four Hellenic Kingdoms and the Province of Judea, and we'll come back to this, but this beautiful picture in the background is actually a reproduction of Alexandria in Egypt, which is part of the Ptolemaic Empire. And Alexandria is still there today. It's actually underwater as it's subsided and the sea levels had some changes. And so they have very detailed plans for Alexandria. And so they've basically been able to recreate what it looked like in those days. And as I'll explain during the lesson, Alexandria is a key place of importance in relation to many of the Bibles that you actually read, and also into the change of languages that the world experienced. So we'll come back to that. So just to start off as we usually do, we're following the genealogy of Jesus, which you find in Matthew chapter 1. We're between verses 12 and 17, after the period of exile to Babylon, after the period of kings. And we're now all the way down to Akim, and Akim is 6 generations a forefather to the birth of Jesus. And so we've hit 300 BC, so we've started off with Abraham around 2000 BC, so we've covered about 1700 years of history and what's been written in the Bible. So we're in this period of time during the Greek Empire, or the Hellenic Empires now, and we'll continue on with that in a moment. During the time of Akim, we have this colour-coded chart that I've produced here. We've estimated that his birth date was about 314 BC, and he's estimated, of course, because there's no biblical story for these descendants, and yet they are the forefathers of Jacob, Joseph, and inevitably Jesus Christ. And we find here with Akim that he was alive during the rule of not Alexander the Great, but the Diadochi, the generals, or the successors as it's known, came after him when the kingdom fulfilled the prophecy of Daniel and broke up into 4 separate kingdoms. And so the rulers which affect Akim in the province of Judah, as it's now called, are the kings from the south and the kings from the north, as the book of Daniel tells us. And to their north and also to their east, it surrounds them now, we have the ruler, Seleucus, Nicator, so he's the Seleucid Empire. And down to the south we have the Ptolemaic Empire. And so what happens, and that's the Egyptian Empire. And so tonight we will go from the first Ptolemy, and we will actually move into the son of that Ptolemy, and we'll also go into the next generation for Seleucus. So we're starting to move through that Greek history. Following this, I'm just going to put up this picture here. This picture basically is a brief understanding of the book of Daniel 11. And in chapter 11 of Daniel, it talks about the prophecy in which the ram will come from the west in a hurry, and it will the goat, I should beg your pardon, the shaggy goat, and it will charge down the ram to the east and knock it down. So the ram had 2 horns, the Bible tells us, one large and one small, and they represented the Medes and the Persians who formed the Medo-Persian Empire together. And so they were knocked out, and we've moved on from that period of time. And Alexander the Great came in. Now, we mentioned before numerous times that Alexander the Great is represented with a goat's horn, funnily enough, here, and he wears the diadem, which is the piece of fabric or the cord that goes around the head with the 2 tassels down the back, which signifies that he is a king. Now, from the life of Alexander the Great, who was short-lived, he began to rule as a Macedonian king when he was 20, and he only ruled until he was 32 years of age. And so because of that, he had no descendants that were actually alive that could rule. He had an unborn son who was legitimate when he died, and he had a brother who was deemed unfit mentally to rule. And so the prophecies of Daniel tell us that none of his descendants would ever rule after him. And so the journey that we've been on, we've shown how that has proven to be the case. History has told us that each of them, in fact, were murdered. So from them, he had 4 generals. And these are them here: Seleucus, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, and Cassander. And so each of these different generals initially started to form new areas of government or regions of government in the Greek Empire or the Macedonian Empire. And what happened is, after Alexander passed away and they couldn't come to an agreement on who was ruling, the short story is they all became kingdoms and they all became kings in their own right. And so we enter into that period of history where the prophecies fulfill, where 4 horns or lesser horns are formed on the goat, and other prophecies speak about how there will be the 4 winds of heaven, or the 4 kings and the 4 kingdoms. And so we found, as we track through, that this has already occurred. So basically history is following Daniel's prophetic visions and proving to the world, in our material sense, that they are, of course, true in nature. Now we've got this other person here who we haven't come to yet, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and he's the one with the hard and dreary face, who will be the worst of all the rulers. So we'll come back to him, but we're just touching on this by way of introduction, just to sort of keep you up to speed with where we're at. Now last week we were having a look at the impact of what was going on in the region and what the impact was for the people in Judea. And so this map that I have here, I've produced, which just focuses on the region of Israel itself. And we find at this point in time that this region is actually controlled by the Ptolemaic Empire, which are the people from Egypt. And so we find here on these notes that the capital city of the sub-province of Samaria was fortified by the pharaoh Ptolemy I Soter. So he made this his fortress or his capital in this region. The place of worship for the Samaritans was here at Mount Gerizim. Of course, the capital for the people of Judah, or the Jews, was here at Jerusalem, and this of course is where they would come to worship at the temple. And Akim, who we're looking at the moment, he of course is born in Bethlehem in the family inheritance, which of course is where Jesus will be born as well. There was a battle that's marked off here, but that was from a previous lesson. But what we found is that along the coast, all of these yellow dots, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Jaffa, Dor, which is modern day Caesarea as it's called. Each of these places, and Akko, who was changed to Ptolemaeus after the new Egyptian ruler. These are a corridor on which trade would go up and down the coast, and also troop movements, which means that the people who lived in this region, in the province of Judea, were left out of all of the wars to this point in time. They were also blessed in that every single ruler allowed them to continue to practice their worship of God, and they were also allowed to not pay taxes every 7th year, which was part of the Lord's commandments. And so they got to live through all these political changes and wars and come through fairly unscathed. So we see God's hand on those people. Now, these cities up here, which are marked with these orange dots, Sepphoris, Gadara, Scythopolis, Gerasa, and Philadelphia, each of those, that's 5 of them, but they eventually ends up becoming 10 cities, which we read about in the New Testament called the Decapolis. And so we find that these cities are formed during this time, during the life of Akim. And so this gives us a good understanding of what's going on. Now finally, this is a regional map, and we find, as I've mentioned, that here's Judea down here with Jerusalem, and we find with the yellow colour, this is part of the Ptolemaic Empire or the Egyptian Empire. And last week we mentioned how the region over here was divided up into 4 separate regions, and they were Syria, Phoenicia, Coal Syria, which is a description of a valley that occurs between mountain ranges in this region, and for the first time the mention of the word Palestine. And so we find during this period of time, this is where the name Palestine came from. And so today, one of the modern day claims for the Palestinians is that they are connected somehow to the people of the past. They're connected to the Philistines. And we know historically that this is not the case. This region was called Palestine then, and much later in modern history, when we got into the time of World War I through to World War II, it became known as Palestine again. And the region, funnily enough, was named that by the British Empire. And so this name was reproduced once more. The map shows the size of the Seleucid Empire, which is by far the largest. It's got the Ptolemaic Empire, and then it's got these regions up here. We did have what was called the Antagonian Empire here, and then we had the Greek kingdoms over here, giving us those 4 different ruling areas that the Bible prophesies about. But as history continues, we find that the ruler that controlled this area here, he was killed, and the area was divided up amongst the remaining 3. So at this point in time, there's now only 3 kingdoms. So that part of the prophecy from the book of Daniel has already been fulfilled, and the times have begun to change. Okay, so I think I will just leave this map on behind me as I get underway today. So as I mentioned, we're during the life of Akim, and this is the second lesson during his life. So this is the only lesson to remain for the life of Akim, and then we move on to the next descendant next week. In Daniel chapter 8, verse 22, and there's only 2 words to mention here, it simply says, the 4 kingdoms that emerged, and so we're talking about this at the moment, how there's kingdoms now because they have their rulers. They've claimed and taken the territory for themselves. They're no longer desiring to be part of a conglomerate empire anymore. They do, however, want to become one empire again. The problem is that each ruler of each region wants to be the emperor of all of the regions, and so they remain in conflict. And so the Bible tells us that they will never have the same power as Alexander the Great. And so we see this farming out because they continue in conflict, so no one entity ever becomes a ruler over the whole former empire again. And so once again, Daniel's prophecies or visions are fulfilled. So the 4 kingdoms that emerged from the Macedonian Empire of Alexander the Great have already been whittled down to 3. The Ptolemaic Empires are mentioned to the south, the expanded Seleucid Empire to the east and Asia Minor, and the expanded kingdom of Thrace and West Asia Minor, as they're now starting to expand in this direction over here. Now, the son of the former ruler of the Antagonian Empire, his name was Demetrius. We introduced him last week. He actually went on the run because when his father's empire was taken over, he decided he better get out of there because he's probably going to lose his life. And he went over to the Peloponnese and had some support from some of the Greeks who were having conflicts within themselves in that region. And so he was a concern because he still commanded a large navy, and he had control of a number of the islands in that region of the Aegean Sea. He also had control of Cyprus and large parts of Greece's southern peninsula, the Peloponnese. So here's Cyprus here, here's the Peloponnese region here, and there's this cluster of islands in the middle. So he's still controlling these regions here. So the Macedonian king and the king of Thrace had good reason to be concerned about his presence in the region, and the pharaoh Ptolemy was also concerned because his cities that were in Phoenicia were open to attack by sea. To consolidate the territories as they now held them, the three kings decided in 300 BC to make a treaty together in order to protect them from a potential comeback by this fellow Demetrius. Ptolemy was also concerned that Seleucus would try to push him back out of Cold Syria, Phoenicia and Palestine, so he sealed his treaty by giving his daughter Arsinoe in marriage to King Lysimachus, who is the king of Thrace. In other words, he's looking for support. So he married his daughter to him, and his other daughter, called Lysandra, he married to the king's son, who was called Agathocles. So basically marrying father and son from the kingdom of Thrace over here. So the Macedonian born king Seleucus had been ruling the Seleucid Empire from the same palace in Babylon that had first been built by who? The Chaldean king called Nabopolassar, who of course was the father of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, so we've been through all of that period of history. Situated on the Euphrates River, it basically became the centre of power in the known world during the reign of his son Nebuchadnezzar. But now, some 300 years later, the centre of power had moved further to the west, and its former significance had dwindled. So in other words, what we're seeing is this portion of the map, all of this that's happening over to the east is not where all of the conflict and all the issues are. All of the conflict and the battles are happening in this region, so having your capital over here out of the way doesn't seem to have much sense anymore. And so he thinks, well, the best thing I can do is move my capital into the region where it's going to be most suited. Now, the prophet Daniel had once graced the same court in Babylon. Shealtiel, one of the descendants who we mentioned, and his father Jehoiakim, who we've mentioned, and also Zerubbabel were all there in Babylon. Now, they were born there, and of course Zerubbabel was the first exile back to Jerusalem. Now, more recently, we found that King Alexander the Great ruled there as well. So we basically have come across a 300-year period where people rule from there, and they no longer see it as the place to control a large empire from. So King Seleucus had decided to build a place called Seleucia on the Tigris River to replace the aging capital. So I'll just go back to this previous map. So here's Babylon. So we're now sort of focusing on this region. So here's Babylon on the side of the Euphrates River, and he built this city named after himself, of course, called Seleucia, and it's just a little bit further to the north. But as he was building it, he's recognised that it's probably a bit of folly. So he wanted to move further to the west. So he decided to build the city of Antioch near the fertile Mediterranean coast of Syria and on the banks of what's known as the Orontes River. And so Antioch, and I'll go back to the bigger map in a moment, is located over here. And so we see a large movement. Century place between east and west, with access to the Mediterranean Sea, King Seleucus strategically built his new capital city to sit on the northern boundary of the territory, and next by Ptolemy to the south. So in other words, he's putting that there. Oops, sorry, the other way. So he's putting it there specifically because he doesn't want them to come up any further in this direction. And so this sews in now, as you may understand. The Bible and Daniel's prophecies talk about the kings of the south and the kings of the north in the next phase of Daniel's teachings in chapter 11. And so we see he's placed himself to the north, and of course we've got Egypt to the south. Judea, Jerusalem are in between the corridor between the two. Once again, it fulfills these prophetic words. So King Seleucus and Pharaoh Ptolemy are the first generation of kings that are identified as either a king of the north. So in Daniel chapter 11, if you have a look there, you'll find that in verse 6 it mentions the king of the north, and in verse 5 it mentions the king of the south. And so we see those mentions of both of those rulers. They were mentioned by the Archangel Gabriel when he gave the word of the Lord to the prophet Daniel. And the reason why is it the north and the south?
Using Jerusalem as reference.
Right, that's exactly why. And why that reference, if you ever look up Isaiah, chapter 60, verse 14, it says, the city of the Lord is Jerusalem. Okay? So the centre for all geography in the world to this day centres around Jerusalem. And so when we talk about east, we talk about this way. We talk about west, we talk about this way. When we talk about north, when we talk about south. So this is the centre of the compass, if you will. And so it's an extraordinary testament, isn't it, to the Lord, that even though people defy the Lord and say this is all rubbish, we find that even the geographical statements of the world and directions are based on what the Lord has put into place. So King Seleucus built another 30 cities, history tells us, but he specifically consolidated his power in Syria by building another 3 cities to form what's called a tetropolis, so 4 cities in total. These comprise the 2 port cities called Seleucia and Laodicea, and so there they are there, Seleucia and Laodicea, and he built a 3rd additional city to his new capital Antioch over here called Apamea. So these 4 cities, so he's put a cluster of 4 specific cities there, but it says he built 30 cities in total, so he's obviously stacking his cards to sit at the top of the Ptolemaic Empire. Now, Seleucia was named after himself, Laodicea was named after his mother, Antioch was named after his father, and Apamea was named after his wife. And so that's where those 4 names come from. So Antioch, so when we read our Bible and we go to the New Testament and we talk about Antioch, where are we talking about? Because there's another Antioch. And so the other Antioch is actually up here in what was called Cilicia in those days, but today it's in today's Turkey. It's called Antakya, and it's this place where they talk about where Paul went. However, some of the scriptures associated with Paul are not that Antioch. They're actually this one here. Okay, there was 2 Antiochs, as we can see here. And so Antioch, the one that's in Turkey, was to become the home of the first Christian church outside of Israel, and the first place where followers of Jesus were called Christians. So that's where we got our name, Christians, and we find that in the book of Acts in chapter 11, verse 26. In the Holy Bible, after Stephen, a man full of faith and the Holy Spirit, was falsely accused and stoned to death in the book of Acts, some of those associated with him scattered, and where did they end up? In Antioch, preaching to the Greeks. Barnabas, a Levite from Cyprus, so here's Cyprus here, so this is going to help you with all these names. He's from Cyprus and he was a Levite, formerly called Joseph, Acts 4 verse 36 tells us, was sent there from the church of Jerusalem, and he in turn brought who? Who did Barnabas bring? He actually brought Paul.
Ah.
See, we read about Paul in the Bible, about him going out, but there's a whole series of things that happened when he went searching, when he lost his sight, etc., and in his travels. But in his travels, he actually met with Barnabas. And remember, Paul was going out and he was doing his separate thing to all of the people who were basically seeking to convert Jewish people. Paul hooked up with Barnabas, we talk about Timothy, and of course they went out to the Gentiles in the region. But they had to be reconciled, they had to come back, and there was the discussions that they had to say, how do we do this thing? Like, are the rules the same for Gentiles as for Jews? And how are we going to practice our faith? How are we going to preach to them? Who should we accept? Should men be circumcised? All those sort of questions were reeling around. And so he was sent there from the church of Jerusalem, and he brought the Apostle Paul from Tarsus. Where's Tarsus? Nice geography lesson tonight. Didn't think you'd be in the New Testament, did you? Tarsus is in Cilicia. Okay. So we find that this region up here has a lot to play in the early days of the Christian church. Okay? And so, of course, as the geographical distance, Israel is not a big country today, and so it doesn't take a long time to traverse up from Jerusalem up to these other locations in reality. And so the Apostle Paul was brought to help the new converts, which talks about that in Acts 11. The Apostle Peter, the disciple of Jesus, also visited Antioch, and we read about that in the book of Galatians in chapter 2. Why did Peter go there? Peter went there because there was the issue with Paul and the discussion and the issues about how we're going to go out to the Gentiles. And so this region has an ongoing flow, and what you have to notice is that these regions and who they were as a people happened during this time of history, during the life of Akim. Because as they were going to and fro, we see the influence of Greek people that would begin to flow from the Greek. We mentioned this last week. This line here, this water that passes through here, the Dardanelles, or the straits here where Philippi is, as we remember now history, we find that this is the line or the barrier between west and east in terms of the name Asia. So when we talk about everything over this side, it's all classified as Asia. When we talk about everything from this side going west, we talk about it as Europe. And so for the first time during the life of Akim, we find that the people from Greece, Macedonia, Thrace, started to move across into this region where before then they never did. So during the time of the Persians and before then, there was no migration that way. In fact, all of the races of people that went across into these countries came from the east. History tells us that they came from a lot of the steppes, so down from below where's Russia today, above Iran, above Iraq, all those countries, Afghanistan, and they moved across this way. And so now we find at this point in history, we have an influx where the Greeks start bringing their customs, their traditions, their practices, their worship of their false gods, etc., and they start to bring them back towards the east. And so this influence means that the language remained the same, and it meant when Christianity was birthed, they were still influenced by Greek culture in a Greek-spoken region. So building the new cities influenced the movement of relatively static populations, I was saying, and the great city of Babylon began to empty. So this is the point in time in history where Babylon basically declined. And it became desolate when most of its people flooded into Seleucia on the Tigris River. So their first move was to go where he was rebuilding his capital. The same happened to Mesopotamia though, because that whole region, throngs of people began to move across to Syria. Why? That's where the building was, that's where the trade was, that's where the money was, that's where the armies were based. And so they started to now move across in a westerly direction. So centuries-old irrigation systems were abandoned and previous fertile land reverted to deserts or swamps as the new capital city of Antioch grew in number. So if you go to those regions today, that description still stands today because Babylon completely disintegrated basically, and all of that northern region is marsh. It did return to desert. It's an arid area now. And so it was literally abandoned at this point in history. So these migrations had a profound effect on the demographics of the empire. People moving from east to west caused Syria's population to become predominantly Babylonian. So we have a new culture starting to come in from that direction, and new foreign gods were introduced to Syria. Amongst them, however, also came many Jews. You might remember from Mesopotamia, there was formerly the area of Assyria. So when the northern kingdom of Israel was taken and the people were removed and taken into all those areas, well, of course, their descendants are now coming back across to the west again. So some of those people continued to practice their faith, and so we see an increase in Jewish people moving into the area of Syria at this point in time. So in effect, the Seleucid Empire became a predominantly Babylonian society ruled from the east coast of the Mediterranean Sea, who spoke with a Greek language and worshipped many foreign gods. And so you see the geopolitical mix changing in this point in history. Now, King Seleucus of Asia was not worried about Demetrius in Greece, but he was concerned by Pharaoh Ptolemy, who had formed alliances with the Macedonian Thracian kings because he had married his daughters to both of them. So in turn, he formed an alliance with Demetrius, so he's the renegade from the former Antigonian Empire, who at this time could only be considered a renegade, as I mentioned, with no kingdom of his own. To seal this alliance, King Seleucus married Stratonice, the daughter of Demetrius, in 299 BC. So we see all these marriages going off to seal the treaties. So this was a great benefit to Demetrius, who had left the mainland in Asia, Asia Minor here. So he'd formerly been the son of the ruler here, he's now over here, and so the ruler of the Seleucid Empire formed an alliance with him, and they formed an alliance with them. So we see them trying to shore up their futures. Now, as soon as this new alliance was forged, it was put to the test in 298 BC, when Demetrius took his large navy to the east and expelled a fellow called Plastarchus, who was the brother of Macedonia's king, from the coastal Mediterranean provinces of Lycia and Cilicia. And at the same time, King Seleucus went south from his new capital in Antioch and raided the newly fortified cities of Samaria, just north of Jerusalem. And so what we're seeing, and this is the effect, so Demetrius came across, he's allied with them, he comes and takes these two areas, and he moves down, and he comes all the way down into what was Palestine to Samaria. If to put it in simple terms, whilst we're sort of following all this, the reality of what's happening is that the safety and the impact on the Jewish people in Judea is getting more risky as history goes forward, because all of this activity is starting to close in on this region rather than being these vast expanses. And so they're all contesting one another, and the Bible says the kings of the north and the kings of the south. So there's going to come a point in time, of course, where that influence comes against the Jewish people. Sorry, just find my place. Now, King Seleucus went south from the capital, as I mentioned, as well, down Samaria. The response to their actions, however, wasn't very noteworthy, because the king Cassander, who was the king of the Macedonians, he died, and he was incapable of intervening. And Ptolemy was taken aback by their swift advances. He just accepted yet another treaty, so nothing actually came of it. There was no change in land or position. So the Macedonian king died, as I mentioned, in 298 BC, but few mourned his passing because he was the one who murdered King Alexander the Great's son. Okay, so they were happy to see the end of him. So in 303 BC, a little bit earlier than this, when Demetrius had liberated Athens and many other Greek towns, he's the fellow that's gone across to here. Basically what's happening is he's trying to get a foothold again and gather support. So over here he has the support because this is the part of Greece who were at odds with all the other contenders. And so he goes down there, and we find that these other cities down here, they form an alliance with him at this point in time. So I'll just leave it at that. But his ambitions were, of course, much bigger. He wanted to go back like his father, and he wants to take over the whole empire. That's his ambitions. Now, King Philip of Macedon had two brothers. One's called Antipater and the other's called Alexander. So I'm going to keep putting up these images to help you. There's a lot to take in. And so here's a further region map, which is a bit more large again. On this map, it shows this orange area and this darker green area is all what was formerly known as Macedonia. This is today's Macedonia here. Macedonia separated only a few years ago from Greece and became its own recognised nation again. So he had these two fellows, Alexander V and Antipater II, and they decided, because they were in conflict when the father passed away, what would they do? They would share it. And so they separated it. There's a river here called the Axios, and so what they said is, okay, on the boundary of that river, one will take this area and the other will take this area. There's another ancient kingdom there called Epirus in those days, and so he was sitting in here, and this white region down here, and I said these other bits here, they're all now controlled by this fellow Demetrius. Okay, so that's the and Thrace, of course, has a larger area now because they went across into Asia, which we mentioned last week. Now, there's a Greek author and philosopher called Plutarch. Some of you may have heard of him if you're into reading those sort of documents. And he actually wrote a book called The Life of Demetrius, and he recorded how the events unfolded. So it reads, "The two remaining brothers were perpetually at variance. One of them, named Antipater, having killed his mother, Thessalonice, Alexander, the older brother, called in the Greek princes to his assistance. Pyrrhus from Epirus," so that's here, he was the king, and Demetrius from the Peloponnesus, which is down here that we just mentioned. Pyrrhus arrived first and seized a considerable part of Macedonia, which he kept for his reward, and by that means became a formidable neighbour to Alexander. Demetrius no sooner received the letters than he marched his forces likewise, and the young prince, who was still more afraid of him on account of his great name and dignity, so he met him at a place called Dium, and received him in a respectful manner, but told him at the same time that his affairs did not require his presence. And so what happened is, in this phrase, that this fellow, the king here, he went to their assistance, and so his actual landmass increased a little bit. So we just see in the oversight of this the constant battles and flux that's going on amongst these different Greek powers. Now the older brother, King Antipater, had murdered his mother Thessalonica. So the younger brother, King Alexander, enlisted the help of two men, as I said, Demetrius and Pyrrhus from Epirus. Now this story continues on from Plutarch. It says, "Hence mutual jealousies arose, and Demetrius, as he was going to sup with Alexander upon his invitation, was informed that there was a design against his life which was to be put in execution in the midst of the entertainment. The consequence of this ended in the death of King Alexander V, and the Macedonian army were concerned that Demetrius would be hostile and attack them, but this did not happen." So, in other words, we're talking about this fellow down here. Continuing on with the reading from Plutarch, it says, "Instead of an appearance of hostilities, he sent a message desiring to speak with them, and vindicated what was done. They recovered their spirits and resolved to receive him with civility. When he came, he found it unnecessary to make long speeches. They hated Antipater for the murder of his mother, and as they had no better prince at hand, they declared Demetrius king and conducted him into Macedonia." And so the Antigonian king from the other side here, who'd gone into this region, he now finds himself ruling over a whole new section of Macedonia. Okay, so he's rapidly gaining territory again. So political marriages were commonplace, and they were seen as a form of assurance when forming an alliance between kings and kingdoms. Demetrius of Macedon had married 5 times already, so to shore up his position, he's now got 5 wives from different kings. I already mentioned his first wife Phila, with whom he had 2 children, a daughter called Stratonice and a son called Antigonus Gonatus. But he also married Eurydice of Athens, Didamia, the sister of King Pyrrhus, so he wants to form an alliance with him. Lanassa, the wife of King Pyrrhus as well, the former wife, so he's married his former wife and his daughter. And Ptolemy, the daughter of Pharaoh Ptolemy, and Eurydice of Egypt, who bore him a son called Demetrius. So in other words, he's married so many people that the Egyptians are in alliance, and he's connected to all the families throughout this region.
Good idea.
So you can see what his intentions are behind this. He's been shunted sideways, and now he's gradually clawing his way back to get power. So just after he ascended the throne of Macedonia to rule much of Greece, he received news that Ptolemy had disavowed his marriage to Eurydice, and her other children, Ptolemy, Coronis, Meleager, and another unknown son. So what was going on here is because Ptolemy, he was dissatisfied because he was marrying all these former allies of his, and so he realised that he was gaining in power. So he's cutting the ties with Egypt because he's now starting to worry about his power in the region. Okay, so the Macedonian people had accepted Demetrius as their king, but he soon became unpopular, and so we're going to read Plutarch again and the life of Demetrius to see what they said of him. It says he not only affected a superfluity of ornament in wearing a double diadem, so that's the tassel which we mentioned, the crown, and a robe of purple interwoven with gold, but he had his shoes made of cloth of gold with soles of fine purple. There was a robe a long time in weaving for him of most sumptuous magnificence. So they're saying that he's putting himself out there as the all-powerful and rich king. Now, we've talked about this before. People from Sidon and Tyre on the Phoenician coast produced a purple dye from a sea snail. I'm not going to go through it all again. We've mentioned this before. As a long and difficult and expensive dye to produce, it required many thousands of snails to produce a minute portion of dye. Known as Tyrian purple, the dye could vary in hue from blue to purple to scarlet, but purple was the most desired colour. And so in the Bible we find that this mention in history about this purple is reserved for rulers, royalty, people of power. And so in the Bible, God instructed Moses, so this is the first time we hear of it, to use its colour for the priestly garments and the curtains of the tabernacle. When King Alexander the Great entered into Jerusalem and the high priest came out, the vision that God gave him showed the high priest wearing purple. And so we see that this is a position that's repeated and repeated. It was obviously used for the curtains of the tabernacle as well. I won't give you all the references, there's many of them. King Solomon brought artisans from Tyre to provide purple fabric for the temple. And Jesus, in the hours before his crucifixion, what did they do to him? They dressed him in purple robes. And why did they do that?
Because he's a king.
Because they proclaimed him to be King of the Jews. Did they allow him to keep wearing that garment? No, they took it back off him because they were just using it to mock him as a false king. Okay, so we see this coming through the Bible. So reading on from this book, The Life of Demetrius, it says, the ostentation of dress offended a people who were unaccustomed to such sights, but his luxurious and dissolute manner of life was a more obnoxious circumstance, and what displeased them most of all was his difficulty of access. For he either refused to see those who applied to him or behaved to them in a harsh and haughty manner. One day, when he seemed to come out in a more obliging temper and to be something less inaccessible, he was presented with several petitions, all which he received and put them in the skirt of his robe. The people, of course, followed him with great joy, but no sooner was he come to the bridge over the Axius than he opened his robe and shook them all into the river. This stung the Macedonians to the heart. When looking for the protection of a king, they found the insolence of a tyrant. And so we see that public opinion's already forming on him. So King Demetrius set about conquering the rest of Greece to the west. There were moments when he almost lost the kingdom of Macedonia with his neighbour from Epirus, but he forced him back and went on to conquer all of Greece, with the exception of Sparta in the south and Aetolia, a mountainous region on the north coast of the Gulf of Corinth. And so that's Aetolia here. And so now he escaped from over here. That was the fourth kingdom that his father had from the prophecy of Daniel. He came over here with his tail between his legs, a navy and a small force, and now he's now ruling all of Greece. Okay, so we find this shift of power. So over the next few years, whilst Demetrius was busy conquering the rest of Greece, the king from Thrace took the opportunity to seize the towns on the west coast of Asia Minor. King Seleucus was also seized a large portion of Cilicia along the Mediterranean coast, and Ptolemy seized Cyprus, Lycia, and eastern Cilicia. So again, I'll put up another map to explain what's going on. So whilst he's busy over here conquering all of this, the kingdom of Thrace were coming across here, and at the same time though, because they were moving this way, of course these people were starting to get a little bit concerned. And so while they're busy, the Ptolemy from Egypt, he put these sorties out, and they went back and they took Lycia, which was part of the new kings. They took back Cyprus, which he had already taken before as well, and they took back what they call the eastern part of Cilicia. And the Seleucid king went onto the other side, onto the western part of Cilicia, and he took this territory back. Okay, so that means that he's now grown there, and they've taken back over everything that he had over there. So that's the changes that's happening. Okay, so when Seleucus from the east, the Ptolemy from the south, and King Lysimachus, who's from Thrace, learnt that the army of Demetrius was vast in size and his navy was much stronger than all of theirs, they decided to unite against him and to form an alliance. They agreed to attack him rather than waiting for him to attack them, and they petitioned King Pyrrhus of Epirus to join them. So again, Plutarch writes about this in the life of Demetrius. So it reads, Demetrius, while he was preparing for his voyage, found himself surrounded with war at home. Ptolemy came with a great fleet to draw Greece off from its present master. Lysimachus invaded Macedonia from Thrace, and Pyrrhus entered it from a nearer quarter. So basically what happens with all of this is Demetrius gets taken out again. I'm not going to give you all the detail, okay? So he'd grown in power very rapidly. He was an arrogant leader. He wasn't from that region, so they said, it's time to put an end to this. So just reading the last part of that writings from Plutarch, it says, Demetrius, thus fallen from the pinnacle of power, fled to Cassandrea with his wife Phila. Nothing could equal her sorrow on this occasion. She could not bear to see the unfortunate Demetrius once more a private man and an exile. In her despair, therefore, and detestation of fortune, who was always more constant to him in her visits of adversity than prosperity, she took poison. So his wife decided to commit suicide. Demetrius, however, resolved to gather up the remains of his wreck, for which he purposed he repaired to Greece and collected such of his friends and officers as he found there. So he collected a few people, and he's going to keep trying to go on. So this fellow Demetrius, he first prepared to invade Asia Minor. He raised an army of 98,000 soldiers, 12,000 horses, and he was building 500 galleys. So still talking big numbers. But now that most of these had mutinied and left, and now that he was no longer a king, he managed to collect all of his ships, but he only managed to take 11,000 foot soldiers and a little bit of cavalry. So basically he'd been mightily reduced. So he left his son Antigonus Gonatas to govern the territories of Greece that he still had left. And as a noble, he once again headed east, and his first objective was to defeat the army of Thrace's king in Asia Minor, who's now on this other side. So entering the Aegean Sea, his navy overcame Ptolemies before making an unopposed landing on the west coast of Asia. So sorry, a lot of history again. This is the journey that's happening at this time. And he went on to capture the towns of Miletus and Sardis. So that's these two places here. Sardis and Miletus is a little bit further to the south there. And again, Plutarch writes about this, and he says, Eurydice, the sister of Phila, received them at Miletus, having brought with her Ptolemies, a daughter she had by Ptolemy. Demetrius married her with a free consent, and soon after attempted the cities in that quarter. Many of them opened their gates to him, and many others he took by force. Among the latter was Sardis. Some of the officers of Lysimachus, that's the Thracian king, likewise deserted him and brought sufficient quantities of money and troops with them. So we see him, he hasn't given up. So the crown prince of Thrace, this fellow called Agathocles, followed close behind, and every time he engaged in a skirmish, Demetrius was superior. So he changed tactics and used his troops to cut off the supply convoys intended for Demetrius. His tactic took effect. Hunger gripped the invaders and turned to famine. and famine then turned to pestilence and often death as the starving men sought to eat anything they could find. Demetrius lost 8,000 men and turned to Tarsus on the coast of Cilicia. Demetrius wrote a letter to King Seleucus then, detailing his misfortune and asked for compassion based on the alliance they had made together at a former time. King Seleucus took pity and ordered his lieutenants in the region to send the stricken army some provisions, but a friend of the king convinced him otherwise, and instead King Seleucus marched into Cilicia with a great army. At first Demetrius was astonished and frightened by the sudden change, but when he realised he was surrounded, he broke through and escaped. So he's literally diminishing and on the run as he goes. So time had passed, and now in late 286 BC, Demetrius was struck down with a bout of illness for 40 days. Some of his men decided to take the opportunity to either defect or disperse and leave altogether. Demetrius was forced yet again to defend himself in battle, but this time when the fighting began, King Seleucus offered no clemency to the enemy troops if they would come over to him. So satisfied at his sincerity, they deserted Demetrius and saluted the king. Demetrius initially fled with a few friends and attendants, but he was finally forced to surrender in 285 BC. So we see the end of a era. We've just covered 15 years of history, so I hope it's not too difficult, but basically we can see he expanded and took this area, which was then reduced. He spontaneously came over to go back into the area from which his father had controlled, and he had the support originally of the Seleucid Empire, and then it was completely shut down, and so his run has come to an end. So whilst the crown prince had been following Demetrius in Asia, his father from Thrace had been busy reorganising the northern Macedonian territory, and the king of Epirus decided to expand from his Macedonian territory and successfully invaded a place called Thessaly. The Athenians liberated themselves, and Antigonus Gonatas the son soon found himself reduced to governing central Greece and the Peloponnese to the south. So once again, basically the Greek side all broke apart all over again. In 285 BC, after Demetrius had been captured, King Pyrrhus of Epirus and King Lysimachus of Thrace started to argue after the attack on Thessaly. They didn't enter into battle, but Lysimachus bought the commanders of Pyrrhus, and he withdrew to his homeland. Southern Macedonia and Thessaly now became part of a further expanding empire of Thrace. So the effect is that Thrace just keeps getting bigger through all this detail. Now, whilst the kings were jostling over control in the west, Ptolemy in Egypt had made his son Ptolemy Philadelphus co-regent in place of his eldest son Ptolemy Coronis. This happened because Coronis was born by Eurydice, whose daughter had married his now captured enemy Demetrius, so he's favouring one over the other. Coronis subsequently fled to Seleucus, who held Demetrius captive, who promised to restore him to the throne. Interesting, isn't it? So the Seleucid king has got captive the former son of this area, and he's now also got the aid of the son from this area. So he's actually holding family members from two other regions, and so he's playing a political game here. And it says, history tells us that Demetrius was treated kindly, but living a life of captivity. Apparently he had a life of excess, and he drank himself to death in 283 BC. And so that was the end of him. Okay, 282 BC, Ptolemy of Egypt died peacefully of old age in his bed. While much of the conflict between the Hellenic rulers took place to his north, there was little that he needed to do. He had no purpose to enter into the conflict when his rivals were killing themselves. So the only reason he was involved was because he didn't want them to come down to the areas that he controlled. He wasn't actually looking to expand. So his son Ptolemy Philadelphus was crowned pharaoh on the 27th of January in 282 BC and became the sole ruler of the Ptolemaic Empire. Now, ruling from Egypt from Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast on the western side of the Nile Delta, Pharaoh Ptolemy Ii had been able to put his energy, while all this is going on, we're going to now come back to what affected the people from Judea. He had been putting his energy into organising a museum and a library for the future. Pretty extraordinary, isn't it? All of this history with people fighting and killing each other for territory, and he's down there in Egypt saying, I'm going to build a museum and an art gallery for the future. He was the one who redirected Alexander the Great's body, created this city, and so he had plans which were different to the rest of the empire. He was looking at setting up a cultural centre, if you will, whereas the rest of them wanted to control everything. So he had this project in mind, and of course this would have a significant impact on the Jewish population that lived there. So I'm just going to put up a picture here first of all, just to show you that this is Alexandria over here. So Alexandria is on the far side, basically on the border between Libya and Egypt today, on the Mediterranean, and this is the city that he actually built from scratch there. Now this picture here is quite incredible. We're talking about Alexandria, so I've just shown you the picture of where it's located. This is a very detailed, what looks like a nice picture, but the reality is that the plans for Alexandria still survive to this day. Alexandria itself is actually underwater in the Mediterranean to this day. And so they have a very good idea of exactly what it looked like and how it was laid out. And so an artist has reproduced the city of Alexandria, so you can see. And one of the things that stands out is over here, there's actually a lighthouse. Mm-hmm. One of the first lighthouses. Okay, because the nature of this front here, in the times of darkness or the storms in the sea, there was rocks and outcrops and whatnot, so he built a lighthouse here. And so the ruins of the base of this lighthouse, of course, are there today under the Mediterranean Sea. And so this statue is a statue of who, do you think? And Alexandria, of course, Alexander the Great. And so he's there adorned. And this is quite extraordinary. Now, this picture over here is Ptolemy Ii Philadelphus. And so as you can see, he's carved in the bust of an Egyptian, because he's deemed a pharaoh. But of course he's not Egyptian, is he? No. He's Greek. But you see the features and the eyes and the styling is done as that of a pharaoh. And so when we look back today at Egyptian pharaohs and we see them all, we assume they're pretty much all Egyptian, don't we, by the looks. But the reality is they were Persians, and then they were Greeks, and then they were Romans. So they actually held that title of pharaoh simply because the word pharaoh is their word for king. And so we mustn't get too caught up with that. So I'm going to read from my notes, and then I'll come back to what's written on the board there. So King Lysimachus had ruled Thrace, in the top above Greece there, without challenge now for 38 years. He'd occupied territory in Asia Minor for 15 years, and more recently occupied Macedonia and Thessaly in Greece. Although he had built a sizable empire, not everyone under his rule was content. The political landscape was shifting. Kings had either died or become elderly, and the many wives of these kings sought to position their own sons on the thrones of power. So all these women that had children to form alliances with, once he gets elderly or old, they think, well, I'm still connected to my relations in my former country, maybe we can take over this one. So it doesn't stop. So Demetrius and Pharaoh Ptolemy had just died. Antigonus ruled what was left of his father's territories in Greece, whilst Ptolemy II ruled Egypt and southern Syria. King Seleucus of Asia was elderly, and as was King Lysimachus of Thrace, and their future heirs, Antiochus and Agathocles respectively, were in positions of power, both crown princes appointed to succeed their fathers, and both ruling over conquering territories. So it is now that the first crack appears. Back in 299 BC, when King Lysimachus of Thrace had married Arsinoe, the daughter of Pharaoh Ptolemy, his son, the crown prince Agathocles, who was born by Nicaea, the daughter of Antipater, also married another of the pharaoh's daughters called Lysandra. But now that King Lysimachus was elderly and Agathocles had been appointed his successor, Arsinoe realised both she and her children would become subjects of her stepson and sister. And because they're from different families and they do not want this to happen. So she decided early in 282 BC to darken the reputation of the crown prince so her own son could become king. It is not known exactly what happened, but King Lysimachus executed his own son, Crown Prince Agathocles, for treason. And so, amazing what happens in power-related marriages, isn't it? So we see the demise of his own son. So Lysandra, the widow of Crown Prince Agathocles, fled with her children. Alexander, the paternal half-brother of him and the prince's servant, to King Seleucus and asked for help. So they always run back and forth between the other empires, don't they, for help. This was an offer the king could not refuse. He could rightfully intervene to place the son of Agathocles on the throne of Thrace, and in Egypt he could rightfully place Ptolemy Coronis on the throne. So he's looking at using those who come to him to place on the throne as puppet kings, which means he would then what? Become the ruler of the whole empire. And so we see the wheels keep turning. Now, throughout all of these shifts in the political landscape between the different Hellenic rulers and the territories they controlled, Akim, who we're following in the genealogy of Jesus, is now aged about 32 years of age in 282 BC. But he had remained outside of the conflicts that were causing the original Macedonian Empire of Alexander the Great to shake and to be torn apart into different spheres of power. Changing from the rule of Pharaoh Ptolemy of Egypt to his son Pharaoh Ptolemy II meant that both the urban city of Jerusalem and the towns and rural villages dotted throughout Judea continued to remain stable, and the people were free to worship the God of Israel and live under his laws. So we see once again a next generation, a new ruler, and they're allowed to continue to have the freedom to worship the God of Israel, to practice their religion, to to not pay their taxes every seventh year as the Lord commanded, and so on. And so again, we see God's hand, despite all of this going on, he protects his people. So the hand of God's protection and provision remained over them as they prospered. And why do you think this had to happen? Why do they prosper despite everything else that's going on around them?
Prophecy.
Prophecy? What happens if we go all the way back to the time of Abraham? What did God do with Abraham?
A covenant.
He made a covenant. Covenant's a contract. So he made an agreement with him, and part of that contract or that agreement was that from his children would come the Messiah. Okay? And so it's God's job, if you will, to protect his people, and specifically that family, in order that the Messiah would be born. And so when we're reading through the genealogy of Jesus and we're looking at all this history, we find what? We find that he still has a purpose for him, even though he doesn't have a story to give us in the Bible. And so we must remember this as we go through. So as was the custom at the time, Seleucus set out to invade the territories of the Thracian king in Asia Minor in the winter of 282 and 281 BC. He appointed his son Antiochus as his successor and made him ruler over all of Asia to east, northern Syria, and the territories of Asia Minor he already governed. At the age of 77, King Seleucus confronted the army of the 80-year-old King Lysimachus. So we're talking about 77-year-old versus an 80-year-old now. In this place in Lydia, in the west of Asia Minor, and by the end of the same day, Lysimachus was dead. Seleucus continued to west to conquer Thrace and Macedonia with the intention of adding them to his empire. And so an old ruler should have passed over the baton, and he didn't, and he ended up dying. So the king of Thrace is no longer. So Ptolemy Coronis, the other son that fled from Egypt, when his younger brother ascended the throne, had accompanied King Seleucus in his war against the Thracian king who just died. After this battle, the new pharaoh of Egypt, Ptolemy II, would have been nervous, for King Seleucus sought to unite Asia and Europe, which means if he did, he would be the only one left separate to all the former territories of the empire. So he would understand that it was expected that Egypt will be next to be reunited, as we say, as part of the former Macedonian Empire. This did not, however, come to fruition, for when they went to Macedonia, King Seleucus was murdered by Ptolemy Coronis, who was so named because Coronis means thunderbolt. And so what we find is how old was he? 80-year-old king. He's now dead. So we find all these people we've been following, all the ones from the first prophecy of Daniel, which were those 4 heads, the 4 horns. Each of them have now gone. None of them remain whatsoever. So suddenly everything had changed. Ptolemy Coronis became king in Europe. So Ptolemy was king in Europe, so that's the western side. So this is Europe on this side. So he was now king on this side, Ptolemy. King Seleucus was succeeded by his son Antiochus in Asia, and the new pharaoh Ptolemy II of Egypt used the confusion to take the Seleucid territories in Cilicia, Pamphylia, Lycia and Caria along the Mediterranean coast. In other words, he went back along this coastline and took all of those territories. Went all the way back along here and took all these territories again. Okay, almost there. So it was under the rule of Ptolemy of the second of Egypt that the project to organise a museum and library for the future by his deceased father Ptolemy I began to take shape. So once again we track the history, but we find that each of these people have a role to play in the outcome for the Jewish people and for us today. The project not only had a significant impact on the Jewish population that had lived there, but saw the Hebrew Bible translated into Greek and reproduced to such an extent that by the 1st century AD it replaced Hebrew as the most common language used to write the word of the Lord. And so what does that mean for us? By the 1st century AD, so we're talking about the time of Christ and the apostles, Hebrew was no longer the dominant language that the scriptures were written in. Okay? So when we see a lot of the scrolls that are produced from these eras, they're no longer in Hebrew, they're now in Greek instead. Okay? What do we know about the New Testament? What language is it written in?
Koine Greek.
Koine Greek. So this aligns with what's being said here. Those people are speaking Greek and they are talking Greek and they are reading Greek. And so the Old Testament, as we call it, or the Hebrew Bible, has now been dominated by the Greek language, and the Hebrew language is now less dominant. What's that going to mean for the Jewish people? Loss of language, loss of ability to read the scriptures in their original form. One of the things that we have today is all the translations of the original scripture, and people like to argue about whose Bible's the right one and who's the wrong one, right? But the fact is that the Bible had become adulterated at this point in time, or the Old Testament as we know it, because the meanings of words aren't always translatable between languages. And so we find that when it was translated, that some of the integrity of the meaning was becoming lost. And this has affected us. And so today, there's a great push again for people to learn Hebrew, to translate scriptures back from the Hebrew. So in other words, getting back to the original language in order to understand the true form that the Bible was originally written in. And this is all occurring during the life of Akim, once again. So, ever since the people of Judah, who we know as the Jews today, meaning the people of Judah, were exiled to Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar, the Hebrew language was under threat. Of course it was under threat when they were in exile. Why? Because they went into a foreign country with a foreign language, and what had the people been doing before they left? They certainly hadn't been reading their Bible. And they certainly didn't take them with them, because they were taken by force and exiled. And suddenly they're in a foreign country. So of course this is the time when the book of Chronicles was written, because they were understanding that they needed to rewrite the scriptures because they no longer had the books of Kings. One of the things we notice when we read the book of Kings is what? It says the Annals of the Kings. So in other words, there was all these writings about the yearly history and what was going on and it's mentioned in the Book of Kings, but there's no record, or there's no copy of it in the modern times. So it tells you that things were definitely lost during that period of time. And so when we read the Book of Kings and we read the Book of Chronicles, we find that there's some variations between what's written, because one was written contemporary to the time and one was written afterwards when they were in exile. So it's like somebody trying to remember and write all the details even though they don't have it in front of them anymore. And so it's understandable there's some slight variations. In fact, it's remarkable how similar they are on that basis. So ever since the people of Judah were exiled to Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar, the Hebrew language was under threat. They were moved to a society that didn't speak Hebrew, and even those who fled before the exile went to places whose native language was different. They gradually lost their knowledge of Hebrew, and it became necessary for the weekly Torah readings, which is, of course, which books? The first 5 books of the Bible, isn't it? It's not all of what we know as the Old Testament, the canon of Hebrew scripture. It's the first 5 books. And the prophetic lessons, so they're the books like Daniel, etc., that we talk about afterwards, to be translated. In the sub-province of Judea, Hebrew was replaced first by Aramaic as the regional language under the Persians, so they're the people before the Greeks, then Greek, and the Jewish scholars and teachers appointed as religious leaders were called rabbi, were forced to write the books in other languages. Okay, so we see things starting to change. Some Jewish people had lived in Egypt since the time of King Nebuchadnezzar II, and we've spoken about that in the past. But they only learned to speak Koine Greek after King Alexander the Great liberated Egypt. Building Alexandria on the western side of the Nile Delta on the Mediterranean coast, many more Jews settled there when Pharaoh Ptolemy I recruited thousands of young men to serve in his army. We mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. Okay, so he paid them money, he promised them that they could continue to practice their religion if they would come and serve in his army. And so they moved there and they took their families there. So in this population of Alexandria, there's a sizable population of Jewish people. Building Alexandria on the western side of the Nile Delta, many more Jews settled there, as I said. They brought wives, children, Levites, and I mentioned this before, the Hazanim, and the Hazanim were musicians who led worshippers in songful prayer. And it was here that the Septuagint, so I've got that on the screen behind me, Septuagint. You can buy this in all good bookshops. Anyone know what the Septuagint means? We look at this as an ancient form of the Bible in its originality. Does anyone know what that word means? What does the word set means?
9.
No.
7.
7.
Ah.
Thank you.
Oh, of course, yeah.
You're thinking of September the
Yeah.
month. I can understand.
It's
The
French, 7, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
But Septuagint actually means, in this particular instance, just find my notes here, it's a Latin word and it's Latin for 70. Okay, so the Septuagint, and there is publications that are happening again of the original Septuagint in this original form, because they see it as the first level of translation from the Hebrew. So people see that as the most authentic Latin or Greek derived version. So it first appeared at this time and became so the most important Greek translation of Jewish scripture. So that was the common scripture that was being read. This is roughly about 282 BC, okay, before Christ. An account was given by a fellow called Aristeas in around 200 BC. He was a courtier of Pharaoh Ptolemy II, who we've just started his life with, who wrote a letter called the Letter to Philocrates. So I have a copy of what he said. He said, the Pentateuch. What does the Pentateuch mean? We've taught this before.
10.
Pent is?
10.
No.
No.
Pent, no.
Repent.
5.
If sept is 7,
5.
Oh, 5.
pent is 5. Right? If you have a pentagon, how many sides does it have?
5.
Okay. So the Pentateuch, what does the word touche mean in Greek? You all know what touche means in Greek. It means teaching. Okay. So the first 5 books of teaching of the Holy Bible, today, if you do studies in the Bible, it's called the Pentateuch. Right? If you do Hebrew studies, it's called the Torah. Same 5 books. So suddenly now we see this used in the language of this writer who's written at the time of Pharaoh Ptolemy II. He says that the Pentateuch was translated at the time of Philadelphus. So it's written down during the life contemporary to Philadelphus that it was actually done there and then. So history records exactly when it happened. The second Ptolemy, and he puts in there the life of this fellow and his ruling 285 to 247 BC, and we're in about 282 BC in our current journey at the moment. It goes on to say, which translation was encouraged by the king and welcomed by the Jews of Alexandria. Why do you think the Jews of Alexandria welcomed a Greek Pentateuch? They could read and write it.
It's their main language. Suddenly
Right.
their main language.
Right.
Mm.
So they had already moved away, their language was affected, and so you can imagine that their kids would have been growing up in society, and if they were being taught, they would have been taught in the language of the Greeks. Okay. So here he is, he's saying which translation was encouraged by the king, and he's actually telling the Jews were happy about this. In other words, history records it. Whatever share the king may have had in the work, it evidently satisfied a pressing need felt by the Jewish community, among whom a knowledge of Hebrew was rapidly waning before the demands of everyday life, recorded in history. And so we find the story right now. Jewish tradition says the Septuagint was written by, and this is why it's called this, 70 Jewish scholars who were translators under royal desire during the reign of Pharaoh Ptolemy II Philadelphus. So in other words, 70 scholars were engaged to translate. And so the Bible, if you will, was called the Septuagint because of the 70 who translated it. That's where the name comes from. So since most people spoke Greek, and those who could read and write read Greek as their primary language, the use of the Septuagint, as each copy was carefully scribed, became more and more common. These early translations were scribed during the lifetime of Akim, but living in the small town of Bethlehem where he was, just south of Jerusalem, the possibility that he had access to one of these was extremely unlikely. Okay, so the last few paragraphs is historical again. Under the king of Thrace, Lysimachus, the geographical position of his kingdom separated the civilized world of Greece to the west and Asia to the east, as we've mentioned earlier, from what were deemed barbaric tribes to the north. Those who lived in the region known today as Bulgaria and Serbia. Here's Bulgaria on today's map where the red lines are, and Serbia is right here. So basically sitting at the top, these people were considered to be barbaric. He had learnt when one tribe threatened, if he negotiated with their neighbours, he could keep the peace. King Seleucus had learnt the same in Central Asia in a period of time against these nomadic tribes in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. So this was a common practice. So they would form a relationship with the neighbour of the people who were going against them, and they would shut it down without having to go into a conflict. With the new generation of leaders, King Antiochus, the son of murdered King Seleucus, was also adept at handling the barbarian tribes because he had spent much time in the eastern provinces with his father, but the new King Ptolemy Coronis, who had murdered his father, was not. Educated in Egypt, King Ptolemy Coronis who now ruled over Thrace, Macedonia and Thessaly in Greece, learnt that a people known as the Galatians, right? They're called the Galatians, and they're from, do you know where the Galatians are from?
The Bible.
Everyone ever read the cartoon Obelix and Asterix? Do you know what language that's in? In its original language, it's in French.
French.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, it is.
Right? So we find that the Galatians originally were derived from northeastern France and southern Germany. And the Germans, when the Romans came against them later in history, they called them the barbarians. Same name was applied. And so we find here that they'd arrived in this region across here. So the French, north of France and Germany as we know it today, in those days they were called the barbarians. They moved all the way through Europe and they were sitting right here at this point in time. So they were a new threat that had entered into the region. When the most prominent Thracian tribes from the north asked for help, King Ptolemy Coronis decided to say no, thinking that if they were weakened by the invading Galatians, then they would be less dangerous to his new kingdom. What does this make you think about with the book of Galatians? New Testament, book of Galatians. Where's it set? We take it as a Greek thing, don't we? Okay, where is it? Where'd the name Galatians come from? Not Greece.
France and Germany.
Okay. Interesting, isn't it? So we see how history affects what we read in the Bible today. We call the book of Galatians. So King Ptolemy Coronis decided to say no, thinking that if they were weakened by the invading Galatians, then they would be less dangerous to his new kingdom. This, however, backfired because the northern tribes of Thrace formed an alliance with the Galatians, and in 279 BC, their leader invaded Macedonia, and in battle, King Ptolemy Coronis was not only defeated, but he was captured and decapitated. And so the Ptolemy power, formerly from Egypt, an illegitimate son, if you will, is no longer in that region. So Ptolemy Coronis had no successor, so Macedonia now had no governing body, and its cities were left to defend themselves until a nobleman called Sosthenes stepped up, and he sent them packing back to the region of Serbia with the loot that they had managed to gain. Another Galatian leader called Brennus then decided to invade Greece and managed to reach central Greece after fighting a coalition of soldiers. And Antigonus Gonatas, who still ruled what was left of his father Greek territory, so that's the son of Demetrius. He reaching Delphi, a thunderstorm and early snow struck, and Brennus was forced to return, suffering heavy losses. The Galatians returned north, and Brennus committed suicide. And so, in history, and when we read our Bible, we talk about the Galatians, they only had a short time there. They came and they went again. And yet, that area became known as Galatia, and this word comes into play, which comes from Northern Europe. Okay, so for Akim and the Jewish people, wrapping up in Judea, life will continue under Ptolemaic rule for a little over 100 years. Coal Syria to their north will be challenged by Antiochus I, the new king of the Seleucid Empire, who seeks to expand his territories in what will become known as the First Syrian War. The fighting was north of the sub-province of Judea and didn't affect its territory or its people. To understand why the Seleucid king sought to conquer Coal Syria, it's important to appreciate that not only did it connect regions from the north and the east with a fertile corridor all the way down to Egypt, but Antiochus and many future generations after him understood that it was their rightful claim to rule this territory as their own because it had been taken by the Ptolemy Empire when the four kingdoms originally separated. Okay, so it was a continued hotspot. So safeguarded from any new foreign invasion and the consequences that will come from it, Akim lived his whole life without any further political change. Pharaoh Ptolemy I, who died at the age of 84, is succeeded by Ptolemy II, as we mentioned, and despite being forced to defend his kingdom against this Antiochus in the future, he was a more peaceful and a civilized king. So what we're saying is that during the life of Akim, so these are the pictures. This is Antiochus I Sota. So he's the new king. So that's a coin, so we can see what he looks like. This, of course, is how Ptolemy is represented down in Egypt here. So this is the king of the north now, and this is the king of the south now entering forward. But the picture that's portrayed here is that they're in the Ptolemy Empire, and so as a result of that, Ptolemy seeks to create a library, he seeks to create a museum. He's a very culturally orientated, brought up person, and so what it meant for the Jewish people was that they were protected, they were allowed to practice their religion, and in fact they were encouraged to even translate their Bible in order that it could be read amongst the citizens.